mainstream Islamists in Syria and elsewhere are very much into that neoliberal approach to governance. I mean, if you look at the way that, for instance, the Muslim Brotherhood was talking about economics 20 years ago. I mean, specifically the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, their platform was very clearly neoliberal already at the time, and Ashara is in a way converging with this Islamist mainstream, notably on that issue.
Hello and welcome to Protean View. I'm Riyadh, as always, here with my co-host Mohammed Bushra, and we're joined for this episode by Dr. Thomas Pierret to talk about Syria, Islamism, and more. Thomas is a senior researcher at the Institute for Research and Studies on the Arab and Muslim World at Aix-Marseille University in France. He received his PhD in political science from Sciences Po in Paris and the University of Louvain. And he was previously a senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, and prior to that, a postdoctoral research associate at Princeton University. His works include Religion and State in Syria, published in 2013 by Cambridge University Press, and Utopianism in the Middle East and North Africa, published in 2025 by Edinburgh University Press. He also has a chapter on Syria forthcoming in the 10th edition of the edited volume, Government and Politics of the Middle East and North Africa. That'll be from Routledge. Before the discussion begins, I just want to say a quick thank you to our supporters on Substack and Patreon, without whom this episode would not be possible. If you like what we do here at Protean View, please consider joining our community on Substack at muftah.org and Patreon at patreon.com/ProteanView, which you can do for as low as $5 a month. To help us keep this show running, please do follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and wherever else you find your podcasts. And don't forget to sign up for our newsletter at muftah.org to stay updated on the latest from us. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. And here now is our conversation with Thomas Pierret. So, Thomas, we wanted to talk to you about where you think the new Syrian government is headed. Can I maybe ask you to tell us about what the new Syrian government is ideologically? How would you describe it ideologically? And perhaps you can also comment on what its economic, social, and political commitments are as compared with the previous regime.
Yeah, well, perhaps the first thing is that it's a political regime that doesn't have a very, strongly articulated ideology. And especially not, I don't think that it could be described as jihadi, although we know that these people come from a jihadi background. But I think there's very little left from that. I mean, the way they govern Syria today. I'm not saying there's nothing left, but perhaps we can come back to it later. But there's very little. I mean, it's not strongly ideological, especially if you compare it to, the way the Islamic State was, administering certain regions of Syria and Iraq, or even, very different kind of regime of the Taliban, which are like really implementing a kind of super conservative agenda. No, that's not what we're seeing in Syria. I mean, there's a great deal of pragmatism, a great deal of adaptation to both domestic and international constraints. So yeah, we see people who are very much ready to make fairly significant, compromise, which go like directly against their previous ideology. I mean, just take the most obvious example, which is this formal alliance with the United States as part of this, anti-IS international coalition, which goes against, everything jihadis are supposed to believe in. I'm not saying there is no ideology at all, but it's still fairly exclusionary. I mean, politically speaking, in the sense that I'm not talking about, religious and ethnic minorities, which are a separate issue. And I'm not saying everything is going okay in that respect, but maybe we can talk about that later. But when it comes to accepting, political competition, genuine political pluralism, party politics, there seem to be quite much against that. I mean, there is this strong tendency to monopolize political power in a fairly autocratic fashion, with not just, in the hands of the president, Ahmad al-Shara, but also in the hands of a few people around him who tend to exert like several functions or hold several positions at the same time. So basically, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Asad al-Shaybani, de facto acts as a prime minister. I mean, like over the last days, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been commenting about, that's just an example, but they've been commenting a lot and issuing formal statements about negotiations with the Syrian Democratic Forces. It's a completely domestic issue, right? We're talking about, negotiations with the Syrian armed group, which is supposed to be reintegrated into the Syrian army. And they're, strangely enough, as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they're very much involved in that issue, because de facto there's no longer. The position of prime minister was abolished in March, last year, when they issued a new constitutional declaration to turn the system into a purely presidential kind of regime. But still, Mr. al-Shara can't do everything on his own, so he still have to, ask his aides to do certain things for him. And so the Minister of Foreign Affairs basically does many things that a prime minister should be doing. There are other examples of lower profile figures who also accumulate many different roles in the regime. So yeah, very strong concentration of political power within the hands of a few people, which I think is, partly, it's not strongly ideological. I think that they do it because they can, in the way that it's a very weak state institutions-wise. It already was under Bashar al-Assad. I mean, it was what scholars would call a fierce state, which was very, very brutal, very despotic. But it was very brutal because it was weak, because its institutions were weak, and because basically it could only be obeyed by force and by sheer brutality with its population. So institutions were weak, and of course they were largely destroyed when the Assad regime collapsed. So you have this new, ruling clan building a state almost from scratch with very little institutional constraints, because most, institutions are gone, at least political institutions. And they do pretty much whatever they want, including fairly baroque, schemes like, I told you about the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's not only, at the same time, as I told you, the kind of office of the prime minister de facto, but they also have something that very much resembles a single party. So there is something called the General Secretariat for Political Affairs, which has its headquarters within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and which is very much operating across Syria as a single party. With they actually took over the financial assets and the offices, like the physical offices of the Ba'ath Party across Syria. So that's where these people now are operating, and they're doing, I don't know, lectures for university students, and they're supposed to supervise. That's how they say them. They define their role themselves. They're supposed to supervise political activities in Syria.
When you say there's no ideology, if we take a step back and we look at Ahmed al-Shara''s former days as Abu Muhammad al-Julani, he did have a clear ideological bent. And one could have said there are clear demarcations about where HTS stood politically. And currently, al-Shara and his government seem to have a clear economic bent at the very least. They seem to be pursuing a certain type of neoliberal economic policy. So could you just clarify what you mean when you say no ideology? And also, is this something, how long can that last for?
Okay, so perhaps three things here. First, even when Ahmad al-Shara was known as Abu Muhammad al-Julani, and when he was ruling over Jabhat al-Nusra more than 10 years ago, he was already quite flexible ideology-wise. So, he started, of course, as a kind of hardcore jihadi. Within a few months, he shifted towards a more pragmatic kind of, jihadi politics by allying with mainstream rebel factions. which is what the Islamic State in Iraq reproached him for. That's that's one of the reasons they broke. And then by 2014, because he was at war with the Islamic State and because they were competing for loyalty within the broader jihadi movement, then he shifted back to a more hardline stance and then again towards a more pragmatic strategy. So there is a record of being flexible and pragmatic. Now I understand what you mean by. I mean, there still is an ideology. I see two things. I mean, before I come to the neoliberal aspect, first, I would say perhaps one of the few things he kept from the jihadi worldview is precisely this very, elite-centered, exclusionary approach to political governance. So basically, you don't really need popular approval to rule. I mean, of course, it's better because it makes your regime more stable. But it's not a kind of precondition of your political legitimacy. My point is, they do not even pretend it's the case. When Hafez al-Assad took over in 1970, so it was by a military coup. But one of the first things he did was to organize a popular referendum to have himself, accepted as president. Of course, it was fake, right? Everyone knows it was rigged and it wasn't a serious. But at least they had to pretend that they had this popular assent, that it was part of their legitimacy. And then he was re-elected every 7 years, as Bashar was. Of course, this was all fake, but they still had to pretend. Now, Ahmad al-Shara was appointed as president by 18 military leaders. He didn't even stage any kind of broader popular acceptance. He said, okay, that's it. I've been appointed as the president, and then we go on from there. By the way, if you read jihadi treaties about how a political ruler should be chosen, it's exactly what they say. And there is a famous treaty written by one of the ideologues of the Islamic State in Iraq back in the 2000s, which says that it's the leaders of the Mujahideen who should appoint the political leader of the community. Well, that's one issue. The other is economics. Of course, there is a strong neoliberal approach to economics, which was already there when they were ruling over Idlib. It was a kind of minimal state approach, which likewise is very different from the way the Islamic State, for instance, was dealing with matters like, let's say, education. I mean, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria was a totalitarian project. They wanted to control everything. They wanted to shape every single social institution according to their ideology. So they would get involved in absolutely everything, including schools, of course. Whereas that's not what the Ahmad al-Shara and his group have been doing. They've been very much in favor, for instance, of private schools, because they think, okay, we're the state, or in Idlib they were not a state, but they were a de facto government. We have very limited resources. That's still the case, by the way. And people, let them sort it out by themselves. Bring in, money from abroad, Islamic charities, which they don't necessarily control, by the way. They can be Islamic charities run by the Muslim Brotherhood, which they don't particularly like, but they're useful because they're bringing money from the private sector, from foreign donors, and so on. Of course, they want to control, key aspects of the economy, like everything that's related to oil and, borders, revenues, and so on. But you're right, it's a very neoliberal approach to governance. I completely agree with that.
And you're saying that neoliberal approach existed in the 2010s in Idlib. It's not just something that came to be recently, right?
Well, it started, when they started to govern Idlib, which is in 2017, because before that they were basically, competing with other groups and they were not really in control. They were not really governing Idlib. They were one among many. But then starting in 2017, they gradually established their hegemony over the province. Then they became the de facto government. And then they established this government, the Syrian Salvation Government. It was a civilian government, supposedly independent, but which they very much controlled. And yes, that was the model from the start. And partly because they had very limited resources, and partly because I think I would say the mainstream Islamists in Syria and elsewhere are very much into that neoliberal approach to governance. I mean, if you look at the way that, for instance, the Muslim Brotherhood was talking about economics 20 years ago. I mean, before the 2011 uprising. I mean, specifically the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, their platform was very clearly neoliberal already at the time, and Ashara is in a way converging with this Islamist mainstream, notably on that issue.
Yeah, the reason I asked is Mohammed and I had co-authored an article back in June where we argued that part of the reason the new government took a neoliberal approach to their economic policy was due to structural constraint. That there was no choice, really. It was either do this or die, because the state, there was no state. I mean, there was nothing to be spoken of as a robust state. There were no international partnerships. The economy was non-existent, heavily sanctioned. It was the country was torn apart. And the new leaders found themselves in this double bind where it was either continue down that path or try to build your country. But by building your country, you have to adopt a number of positions, economic and political, that are perhaps less than desirable. But what you're saying is a little different. You're saying it's not exactly that these are not desirable policies. They agree with neoliberal models of economics. They agree with taking approaches like this. And this is a trend among Islamists.
Yeah. And of course, I'm not dismissing the weight of structural constraints, right? I'm not saying it's negligible, but yes, and also, I mean, if you look at the kind of people they're relying upon, they're not really trying to build a party, right? I mean, I mentioned something that resembles a single party earlier, but the point is not. It's really to appoint key people who are loyal to Ahmad al-Shara as a person, like individually. They don't really want people to become loyal to an organization, or I mean, HTS has essentially dissolved itself into the security apparatus and the army. I don't think it remains as a self-standing organization, and I don't think there is any desire by al-Shara to preserve it as an organization. This single party-like structure I mentioned earlier, it doesn't really recruit among former HTS people. They recruit among fairly young people who are educated people, who typically graduates from political sciences or from the University of Idlib, who don't really care much, I think, about hardline jihadi ideology. They're loyal to Ahmad al-Shara because they owe everything to him. Yeah, so because he's not really trying to create a proper political party, he's very much also trying to rely on traditional social elites. I mean, traditional or not so traditional, but let's say notables, either traditional notables, like, let's say, tribal chiefs, or what I would call new notables, for instance, people who have gained prominence during the war, for instance, by running charities. I mean, situation of most people being so dire during the war. I mean, people who run successful charities have become, of course, extremely influential. And if you look, for instance, at the people who were, between quotation marks, elected during the parliamentary elections in October, which, by the way, they don't seem to care much about the parliament because it hasn't, started operating yet. But at least it was interesting to look at the people who were selected in that process, and many of them were exactly, these either traditional or new notables, who I think very much embrace that broadly speaking neoliberal view that society should sort out its problems by themselves, should not wait like for the state to solve everything. Yeah, I think there is and of course, one of the first steps, a few days after the al-Shara and his group toppled Bashar al-Assad, one of the very first statements of the new government was addressed to the business community. saying, okay, we will take care of your interests. Don't worry, we will respect, the market, and we won't try to interfere too much with business, and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, that's how, I mean, Mohammed and I started our article mentioning this, that it was like 24 or 48 hours after the fall of Assad, had barely been a day or two, and that was one of the first official statements that was made. And till this day, you still see a lot of language about commerce, about trade, and so on. I mean, in the trilateral agreement recently, not the trilateral agreement, what was it called? There was a joint statement that the U.S., Israel, and Syria put out recently about establishing a joint mechanism or a fusion cell for ongoing diplomatic negotiation and demilitarization and so forth. And one of the points in that statement was that Israel and Syria had agreed to immediately look into what was it, commercial interest or commercial opportunities or something of that sort. So the discourse on commerce and business and enterprise and so forth has been fairly consistent since, I guess, day one or day two of the fall of the former regime.
Yeah, I agree, but perhaps on that specific point, this joint statement with the U.S. and Israel, I don't think that the new Syrian regime is very much interested in doing business with Israel. I think they were forced to sign that statement because, okay, it's the U.S. that's getting involved. I think for them, the best outcome for them would be basically to come back to the status quo ante. So the situation that prevailed under Assad, which is this kind of, state of war without any actual, clash between the two militaries. Because I don't think that the new Syrian government is interested in peace with Israel. They know that it would be immensely costly, in terms of domestic legitimacy, that most Syrians don't want to hear about peace with Israel, especially if they don't get the Golan back, which of course the Israelis have no intention to do. So yeah, but otherwise, except for that, that joint statement, they're basically claiming they're going to rebuild the country thanks to private investment and some more oil now because they've retrieved control over like the eastern oil fields from the Syrian Democratic Forces. But in that way, they're also adapting to the regional environment, which is that Gulf countries which used to give out money without really, looking very, very carefully at what the kind of use that was made of their money, have themselves, shifted towards a more neoliberal approach where they basically, they're not giving out money for free. They want to invest and they want return on investment. So also, the Syrian government has to adjust to that new reality.
Yeah, no, I agree. By the way, that I don't think Syria is interested in establishing, some kind of a business venture with Israel. I was just trying to point out that it's interesting and notable that the discourse on commerce continues to come up in different contexts, including in that joint statement. But otherwise, yes, I agree. But since you brought up Israel, I think now is a good time to talk about where the new Syrian government stands with regard to the Israeli state. Especially in light of recent comments and comments that have been made, frankly, since the start about the Abraham Accords and diplomacy. Shara seems to be taking, or at least he has seemed to since the start, to toe a very specific line on Israel where he's cautiously not antagonistic, but he's not friendly either. He doesn't want to appear antagonistic. He doesn't want to appear friendly. And while he and others in the government have said, we can't sign on to the Abraham Accords, it's just not, the conditions are not suitable for us to sign the Abraham Accords, they have nonetheless, as far as I can see, consistently said that under the right conditions, in principle, in theory, we could sign on to something like that, but the right conditions have to be present. Is that just kind of like a statement they feel they have to make publicly, or is there some truth to that, or what's going on?
Well, first of all, I think that was in the spring last year, 2025, when the rumors started to spread about Syria being interested in joining the Abraham Accords, and then the first direct negotiations started between Syrian and Israeli officials in Paris and Azerbaijan and so on. I think these rumors about like a formal peace treaty being in the making, they were deliberately spread by the Israelis themselves to put some sort of pressure on the Syrians. What the Syrians were interested in and what they were talking about, and I think both in public and private, was a new security agreement, which is not a peace treaty, which is basically, as I told earlier, return to the statu quo ante, so returning to something that resembles the 1974 ceasefire agreement, which was already brokered by the US, so the one that followed the 1973 war. So what the Syrian government is interested in is to retrieve those regions that were occupied by Israel on December 8, 2024, which is, the demilitarized zone and other, areas nearby. And first of all, an end to military, to incursions by the Israeli military into Syrian territory, and occasional airstrikes against Syrian territory as well. So I think that's what they're mostly interested in. Now they're basically aware that it would be a new version of the security agreement. It would not be exactly the same. They probably know they would have to concede certain things, but I don't think they want to go farther than a security agreement. I don't think there's been any serious talk about a peace treaty, honestly, because the Israelis are not even ready to discuss a withdrawal from the regions apparently they're not even ready to consider withdrawing from the regions they occupied on December 8, 2024. So Mount Hermon or Jabal al-Sheikh, which they want to keep because it helps them monitoring the whole border between Syria and Lebanon. There is also some water resources involved. I think one of the reasons the negotiations haven't succeeded so far is that, as I said, the Syrian government want a return to that security agreement of 1974 with some adjustments, whereas the Israelis, honestly, the only thing they're interested in is a formal peace treaty. Because, military-wise or security-wise, they don't need a security agreement with Syria. They do what they want in Syria, as they show every day. And they can arrest people, they can, bomb places, destroy stuff. So they don't feel any constraint in the current situation. And by contrast, they feel that a new security agreement would put constraints on their operations inside Syria. So they're only interested in a peace treaty because what they're interested in is regional legitimacy.
So you've touched upon this previously, but I wanted to dig a little bit deeper. In terms of the future of Syria, Al-Shara doesn't particularly seem to be interested in democracy. The Western powers, such as the US, who are getting involved, don't particularly seem to be interested in democracy for Syria either. And likewise, a lot of the governments regionally, Jordan, the Gulf, don't seem to be interested in the question of democracy in Syria either. It's what they all seem to be quite interested in. And again, I think this dovetails quite nicely with the approach to neoliberalism, is a sort of technocratic government, which is kind of just concerning itself with. And again, it also dovetails with this other point that you made about the kind of culmination of this Ahl al-Halli wal-Aqd sort of approach to politics, which is very much prominent not only in, I think, some of the kind of retroactive classical approaches to governance, but also very prominent in places like Saudi Arabia, where, the Majlis al-Shura is essentially appointed by the king. Where are we headed? Like, is there any hope for anything that the kind of revolution was calling for? Or is this the end point? Are we kind of headed at best for like a Gulf-style sort of presidential system that is very autocratic, very technocratic, maybe very forward-looking in terms of its neoliberalism, but otherwise there's no representation.
Yeah, it reminds me of a Syrian intellectual, and I'm sorry I don't remember who wrote that recently, but I will quote him nevertheless, who said, well, there's no doubt that governance in Syria is better now, but that's not the reason why we did a revolution. We did not do it for better governance. We did for a wholly different kind of governance, which takes into account, popular will. Indeed, what you say is absolutely correct. I mean, internationally, hardly anyone is interested in democracy in Syria. Everyone is into stability. I mean, security and stability, and you definitely see some impatience, including among people who have, for instance, agreed to play the game of these indirect elections in October last year. But they're not even indirect elections, by the way, because there was no popular votes. I mean, like the voters themselves were selected. But some people, went into that game saying, okay, that's not ideal. That's not what we're hoping for. We would like to have free elections. We would like to have, proper party politics. And some of these people, by the way, already established de facto political parties, but they're not legal because there is no law on parties. The law on parties was announced in the constitutional declaration in March last year, but there's been no discussion about it whatsoever since then. And some of these people who want to be allowed to be to legally establish political parties have been told that anyway it won't happen until the end of the transitional period, which means 5 years from the constitutional declarations. Okay. So I think that's a good reflection of the intentions of the people who rule Syria these days. I mean, they're not very much interested in party politics. Now we'll see with the parliament, because the parliament was incomplete for two reasons. First, because some provinces didn't have elections because they were not under the control of the Syrian government. So that's mostly the case of those regions that were under the control of the Syrian Democratic Forces, which have recently returned, at least officially, under the control of the Syrian government. And then the Druze majority province of Suwaida, which is controlled by local armed groups, which are basically seceding from Damascus. So now they have said, I mean, the Syrian officials have said that they will be able to conduct elections in the regions that were formerly under the control of the Syrian Democratic Forces. But then there is also the so-called presidential third. So meaning 1/3 of the deputies have to be appointed directly by the president. And he still hasn't appointed them. And he was expected to do so right after the elections in October. And so now we're in February and he hasn't done anything. So we'll see if he eventually does it. But the whole, idea is that they're very little interested in having a functional parliament, even one they have appointed themselves. It's quite striking. I mean, it's not a free elected parliament. It's largely been handpicked, and nevertheless, they don't seem to be willing to give it any significant role. Well, maybe it will change. I mean, they still haven't made many major decisions when it comes to, reforming the legal system. And perhaps when time comes to do so, they will perhaps need some legitimation from a legislative body. But so far, we haven't seen anything. And, that's a worrying sign. And the other definitely is the role of this single party-like structure I mentioned earlier. So the General Secretariat for Political Affairs seems to try to I wouldn't say overtly censor, but chaperone civil society activities and things like that. Yeah, I think we really want to see more to be reassured in that respect.
Another somewhat related question is relating to the relationship with Gulf countries and in particular Saudi Arabia. Previously, Shara', as I guess Al-Julani, used to be very sharply critical of the Gulf countries and in particular of Saudi Arabia, which is obviously reflective of a very standard kind of jihadi position vis-a-vis the Saudi government, and in particular in terms of its relationship with the United States. This has changed. He seemed very friendly. He had a very good trip to Riyadh and seemed very friendly with the royal family, and also, kind of even drew upon his upbringing in Saudi Arabia as a, point of convergence. They seem to be very much in line with the Saudis now. They seem to be very much drawing inspiration from things like Vision 2030 and other such Saudi projects. How are we to read this? Is this just a tactical thing, or is it something long-term that has changed? Is it, quote-unquote maturity?
Well, I see three elements here. Of course, there is a great deal of pragmatism again. They need the Saudis, economically speaking, for at two levels. One, of course, is they want Saudi investments, right? But also the Saudis were key in convincing Donald Trump to lift sanctions against Syria, and that was the absolute precondition for, any kind of foreign investment in Syria. They had to get rid of sanctions, and so that was it was absolutely vital for al-Shara to have the Saudis on board and help him, convince Trump to do that. And as we remember, the major shift in the U.S. policy towards the new Syrian regime was this meeting in May 2025 between al-Shara and Trump in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, in the presence of Mohammed bin Salman. It's absolutely crucial, and I think the ongoing goodwill of the Trump administration towards the Syrian government, as recently as during the military clashes with the Syrian Democratic Forces a few weeks ago, where Tom Barak, the U.S. ambassador or special envoy to Syria, was, as he has always been, very supportive of the position of the Damascus Syrian government. This is to an extent a result of Saudi and Turkish pressures on the U.S. administration to support the Syrian government. Now, there is a third dimension which perhaps links to issues we've discussed earlier. I suspect Ahmad al-Shara sees the political regime in Saudi Arabia as something that's quite attractive. No elections, a consultative assembly that's appointed. We didn't discuss the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood so far, but the Muslim Brotherhood, the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood was, its members were allowed to come back to Syria, but they were not allowed to open offices and to operate legally. Last August, you have Ahmad Zaidan, so this former Al Jazeera journalist, who is himself an Islamist. He was himself a member of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. He even married the daughter of the leader of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. He was that close to the organization, but he's become the chief media advisor of Ahmad al-Shara, even before al-Shara took over, actually. And he penned an op-ed on the Al Jazeera website asking the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood to disband itself, arguing it would, provide for better relations with Gulf countries, and that anyway it was useless. It was a kind of dinosaur organization. It had lost its popular base, and but at the same time, okay, that kind of discourse, it's a way to adjust to the expectations of countries like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates to a lesser extent. But I think it's also quite convenient for the new regime. It's so easy when you don't have any organized opposition at all.
So to broaden the question a bit, does this portend something for the future of Islamism in the 21st century? The old guard, Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the Nahda in Tunisia, and so on, the very kind of, they had their experiment post 2011. They largely failed for various reasons. They were also very slow moving. Slow to adapt, and also quick to capitulate in many respects. Whereas now here we have another example, al-Shara, who is, I guess, moving in a much more autocratic direction, is not interested in political parties like you just mentioned. Even now, even something like the Muslim Brotherhood, which you'd think ideologically they'd be fine with and largely are in agreement with it in terms of neoliberalism, they are asking them to disband. What is the future of Arab Islamism specifically? Like, is there, and does this have any indication of kind of for trends of Islamism more generally? If we see, you mentioned the example of Afghanistan as well. It just seems that, it's not clear what direction it's headed in and how strongly it's holding to ideological commitments, which we discussed earlier.
Well, mainstream Islamism, I mean, if you look at history, or the history of the last century, it was relatively successful in, let's say, quasi-liberal, I mean, in politically liberal contexts or quasi-liberal contexts, meaning, the British colonial, occupation of Egypt, you had this quasi-liberal system with, of course, it was no democracy, no free elections, but a great deal of, press freedom, freedom of organization. There was this political space, this minimal political space to organize and set up something like the Muslim Brotherhood. If you look at Syria, the organization was quite successful in the late 40s and the 1950s under the liberal regimes. It was not very big, but they had a few ministers. They even had one of their friends who was prime minister twice, Maruf al-Dawalibi. They were quite happy and successful in that context. And by the way, if you read their literature, they've in the following decade under the Ba'athist regime, they were so overtly nostalgic of that liberal era. They still are. I mean, those who are still alive are still very much nostalgic of that era. Which they see as a lost golden age, if you want. But again, at a broader regional scale, you see that these movements, they're coming back to the fore in the 80s, 90s, in those countries where there is some limited, defensive liberalization or, political opening, like Jordan, like Morocco, Egypt under Mubarak and so forth. And then, of course, after the 2011 revolutions, my point is these movements, they're not fit for hardcore authoritarian regimes. I don't think they're really designed to survive or to thrive in such context. I mean, they can survive for long they're not very good at surviving underground. They usually survive in exile. And they're pretty good at surviving in exile over several generations. And I mean, the paradox here is that, the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood is pretty much the only structured political organization or the only organized, political group in Syria these days, outside of the government. I mean, they still hold elections every 4 years to elect a new leader. And they change leaders pretty much all the time. It's not just like, one family where the position gets, passed from generation to generation, which is the case in smaller Syrian parties, by the way. So it's quite functional as an organization, but it's mostly, elderly people who have been living in exile. And so the future doesn't seem very, very bright for those people. Then you have other smaller political organizations which are very close ideologically to the Muslim Brotherhood. It is kind of, mainstream, moderate Islamism. But they're also they're not really, they don't feel very comfortable in the new political system either. Some of them run for elections in last October. They were not very successful in general. I mean, there were a few of them who got elected, but they were vastly outnumbered by these notables I mentioned earlier. Yeah, the problem is when you don't make any space for mainstream political forces, you tend to make more space for people who are in that mainstream. I mean, like you give more weight and more relevance to the radical fringe, i.e., people like the Islamic State or who lie in wait. They wait for the new government to make errors, to suffer from loss of legitimacy for whatever reason, and then try to take advantage of that situation.
To what extent might one say that it seems that, to a large extent, the future of Islamism seems like identity politics? People are quite content with kind of the aesthetics of the new Syrian government and the kind of image that it's projecting in terms of its logos and in terms of it's holding on to certain kind of Islamic sloganeering. But beyond that, neoliberalism, technocracy, no strong ideological commitment. But people seem to be quite on board with that. Is that something that we can see maybe as a broader trend?
Possibly. And well, I suppose it might be attractive in the coming years, either for the government or for, let's say, what we could call the Islamist opposition in the broad sense, to play on identity politics because they can't do anything else. I mean, a few people have already started doing so, by the way. For instance, there is someone who's been elected to parliament in Homs, who's a former member in an Islamist rebel faction. And he wrote an interesting criticism of the constitutional declaration that was released last March 2025. What he argued was that it was too autocratic. So that's the liberal side of the criticism. But he also said it's not Islamic enough. So he was trying to sort of out-Muslim the new government. Although he comes from a rebel faction like Ahrar Sham, which was supposed to be more mainstream, if you want, more moderate than HTS. Also, when it comes to minorities, and that's also a card that can be played by either side. At this very moment, the Syrian government has a fairly pragmatic approach to the issue of minorities. I mean, if you look at, for instance, Alawites, and of course, I'm not talking about the massacres in March last year, but over the last months, they've started to set up, for instance, local police forces that recruit among Alawites, because they realize that, that's the only way to preserve some level of stability and security, is to have locals, in Alawite majority regions, to have locals involved in policing, which sounds like a fairly reasonable policy, which moves away from, let's say, scapegoating of minorities. But if things turn sour for the government for whatever reason, it's something they could easily revert to. Scapegoating of minorities, because it's an easy way to get out of trouble. That's true in the Middle East, that's true in Europe, and that's true in the United States as well, as you know very well.
I want to pivot a little bit and talk about the response to Ahmed al-Shara and the palpable shift the public seems to be responding to and feeling when it comes to his public statements, specifically on the Muslim Brotherhood, Islamism, Palestine, things that 10 years ago, say in 2015, he would have said very different things about. So on the issue of Palestine, he's famous for having said it was the wellspring of his political consciousness. And as Mohammed said earlier, on the issue of the Gulf states, he once dismissed them as being, decadent rentier states. And on the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood, in an interview with Ahmed Mansour, I think in 2015, he said that one of the big mistakes the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt did was to trust the West. Because as soon as they trusted the West, they opened themselves up to being betrayed and backstabbed and so on, right? So obviously we're looking at a very different person today. Mohammed and I have argued that focusing too much on the figure of al-Shara to explain these shifts is politically distracting. We feel that almost anybody in this position would have probably taken a similar path, given the structural constraints. And therefore, when the left, or segments of the left say, aha, see, we told you. Al-Shara was always this duplicitous agent of the West. He's just now showing his true colors. Our response is to say, you're missing the bigger picture here. It's not really about Ahmed al-Shara as a figure. And we say the same in response to those who insist that al-Shara is playing, 4D chess. He's playing the long game. He's just trying to acquire as much power as possible from a position of weakness in the endeavor to eventually turn that power against the forces that he initially claimed he was against, whether that be the Gulf states or Israel or whatever else, right? I'm wondering where you stand on that debate in particular. Do you agree with our assessment that that's somewhat of a politically distracting discussion, or do you think there's something to either of these sides of the debate?
Well, I broadly agree with you. I mean, he's in such position of weakness that, I mean, it's hard to figure out, what other policy he could have adopted after he took over in Damascus, either with regard to, of course, to Israel or with regard to the United States. Yeah, by the way, that's an anecdote, but perhaps you heard, like, last December, when there were, again, negotiations with all sorts of semi-covered negotiations with the Israelis. There were images of Syrian soldiers who were chants against Israel during a military parade. I think that was in Deir ez-Zor, perhaps, or even in Damascus, which was, by the way, it was almost certainly engineered, if you want. Syrian authorities wanted, or were I'm not sure they wanted, but they were quite happy for this kind of message to go through, which, links to what we discussed earlier, which is that they perhaps wanted to remind the Israelis that they're negotiating, they're interested in a security agreement, they don't really want to go farther than that. Because, look, even inside our military, most people anyway are against you, so it's impossible. We could even think about signing a peace treaty with you guys. I think that's the message. Now, when I think the perhaps not so much the personality of Ahmad al-Shara is important, but perhaps its approach to leadership. Basically, the fact that he built a highly personalized organization, which is now turning into a highly personalized kind of state or state authority, rather than, let's say, a more structured movement with like a strong ideology and let's say something that would resemble like the Islamic State, for instance, where by the way, there's never been such level of personalization in authority. Like in the Islamic State, caliphs were killed and replaced by other guys, and then things would go on because the Islamic State was never built around an individual, the way HTS was built around al-Shara's figure, who also took care to dismantle any kind of competing center of power within the organization through, extensive purges, by appointing people through non-military positions and so on. And he started doing so many years ago. So in around 2019, 2020, he started really to try to, to get rid of whoever could challenge his leadership within the organization. But that results in a political regime where it's probably easier for him to impose such pragmatic decisions, which are, of course, imposed upon him by structural constraints, as you explained. He can do that fairly easily because there isn't much pushback inside the regime. So I think perhaps that's where his approach to leadership makes a difference. It's easier to make it accepted by people within, what used to be HTS, within the government and among the population at large. But in the end, anyone in his position would probably have done the same, I assume.
Relatedly, what's the future of the dissident in Syria? I have in mind here the recent cases of Jassim al-Shamsi and Bilal Abdul Karim, both of whom are imprisoned. I think Bilal Abdul Karim has been imprisoned for the past 2 months now. Jassim al-Shamsi has been imprisoned since November. And in both cases, we don't necessarily know where these individuals are. There are no public charges against them as far as we know. And there's no significant pushback as far as anyone can see. But both of them seem to be imprisoned for... Well, actually, it's not clear that they're imprisoned for the same reason. I was going to say they're prisoners of conscience in some capacity, but it seems that in the case of Jassim al-Shamsi, he's imprisoned because there was a call by the UAE to extradite him, whereas for Bilal, he's imprisoned for being a journalist, I suppose, a provocateur in the eyes of the new government, but fundamentally a journalist speaking about issues more or less the same as what he had been doing in the days of the revolution. Not much has changed in that regard. So where do you think what's the future of the dissident in Syria? And maybe if you can, could you speak a little bit about these two cases, about Jassim al-Shamsi and Bilal Abdul Karim?
Yeah, I don't know much about these two cases, but you're right. I know a bit more about Bilal Abdul Karim. I mean, he's been jailed because he's been outspoken all along. I mean, and he's been critical of Ashara for, I think, even before the Ashara took over. So he's been talking about issues of political prisoners and so on. Okay, at the moment, there are political prisoners in Syria, but most of them were jailed before December 2024. They were jailed during the protests in Idlib against the Ashara. Many of them belong to Islamist groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, for instance. Overall, there aren't that many political prisoners. I mean, of course, if you compare with the previous regime, right? It doesn't compare. And there is also, so far, there are red lines, as the case of Bilal Abdel Karim proves, but there is still a great deal of freedom of expression. Okay, you can all talk, public talks, and be critical of the government, of course, within certain limits, but in ways that were completely unthinkable under the previous regime. The problem is we're still in a sort of post-regime fall or Assad regime fall, period during which people are ready to, give the new government time, okay, including to solve economic issues and of course, for instance, the economy was in such a bad shape when Assad fell that it can only get better, even if it's not much. But people, and now with some oil revenues coming in, people will probably see some sort of improvement. But that won't last forever. I mean, some reality will hit at some point. No government can make people happy forever, even in fairly wealthy countries, which Syria isn't and won't be in the foreseeable future. So when problems begin in earnest, there are only a few different ways to deal with your position. Either you open up the political system, and so you allow people to establish political parties and to do some sort of political competition, even if you monitor it very closely. And that's basically the strategy of Jordan and Morocco in the Arab world. That's what these are basically the poor monarchies in the Arab world, which decided to handle dissent through this semi-liberal approach. The other approach is what Saudi Arabia used to do before MBS, which was to give people money, basically. So you would basically try to silence people by co-opting them by giving out money, which the Syrian government cannot do because it doesn't have money, and it's not gonna have a lot of money anyway. And so you're faced with the third option, which is to crack down on dissent and to jail and kill people. So basically, they will have two options, when faced with significant dissent, which will be either to crack down or open up the political system.
I should have clarified with regard to Jassim Shamsi, he is not technically a dissident. He's an Emirati dissident. He's not a dissident against the Syrian regime. He's someone who lives in exile in Syria as a result of his activism during the Arab Spring. He married a Syrian woman, ended up staying there, and was publicly very pleased and excited about the fall of the Assad regime, which is why it's been surprising to many observers that the government would arrest him. This is someone who, by all accounts, is a great supporter of the new government. But because it's in a position of weakness and it appears it needs to curry favor with the UAE, it's willing to arrest and disappear even someone like him for its broader long-term objectives and aims. So I just wanted to clarify that about him.
Yeah, well, there are other cases. I mean, not many that I know, but there is an Egyptian citizen who was arrested last year. Who was he was even a member of HTS. He was an HTS fighter, but he was also the leader of something called the movement, the 25th of January movement, which is a kind of Egyptian revolutionary organization. I don't know how big, probably very small anyway, but who released a video in which he threatened Marshal Sisi of suffering the same fate as Bashar al-Assad, and he was arrested immediately. Yeah, well, I'm not sure it tells us much about Syrian domestic politics. I mean, as you probably as you said, I mean, it's about bilateral relations with these very wealthy or influential countries like the UAE and Egypt, and they probably do whatever they want to keep them happy. But I think it's a fairly separate issue from. I think that the case of Bilal Abdel Karim is more indicative of the lack of tolerance for genuinely critical voices.
So shifting gears somewhat, the British have not been shy about their involvement in giving Shara and co. a PR makeover even several months before Damascus was taken. Likewise, there's several DC-based counterterrorism researchers at organizations like the Washington Institute who've been very involved in both rehabilitating the image of Shara and those around him, as well as in setting up meetings. So what exactly do we know of the extent of Western involvement in grooming HTS or Shara specifically for this role?
I mean, just to start with this very specific case of the Washington Institute you mentioned, it's a bit puzzling to me because you're right. I mean, it's been very much instrumental in improving the image of HTS, as you said, even before the fall of Assad, for instance, by highlighting the efficiency or the effectiveness of HTS counterterrorism efforts. But I say it's puzzling because my understanding was that the Washington Institute tend to reflect Israel's views on many things, whereas I don't think the Western policies towards the Syrian regime, but if by Western we understand like European and European countries and the US, I don't think they clearly align with the Israeli approach to the new regime. I mean, the Israelis have been extremely hostile to the new government in many ways. I think that the Israelis aren't very happy, for instance, with the outright US support for the Syrian government's military operations against the Syrian Democratic Forces. I think the Israelis were quite happy to keep Syria divided between several state and quasi-state entities. They've been quite open about it. Okay, I'm not inventing anything here. So I don't think there is a complete alignment between these policies. For European governments, they value stability. They hope that stability will lead to a situation that allows for sending back Syrian refugees, sending them back home. It facilitates, counter-terrorism operations. So I think that these are the main reasons for the support for the Syrian government. Of course, in addition to the lobbying on the part of Saudi Arabia and Turkey in particular. But with regard to the role of think tanks, especially before 2024, I'm not sure they were necessarily following the agenda of Western governments. These organizations also have their own rationale, which, let's say if you take organizations like International Crisis Group, for instance, their whole raison d'être is to foster dialogue between, warring parties in conflicts. Now, no one was interested in fostering, or almost no one was interested in fostering dialogue with the Assad regime, both because, of course, Western governments weren't really interested, and also because, honestly, many serious researchers had rapidly come to the conclusion that it was useless. It was really rotten to the core, as its fall in 2024, proved in my view. Now, what was left was essentially HTS, the Syrian Democratic Forces. And by the way, to be fair, some people now accuse some think tanks of, in a way, whitewashing HTS over the last 5 or 6 years. But sometimes the very same think tanks were sort of whitewashing the SDF as well. And maybe whitewashing is too strong. That's not the way I would portray it. But at least they were trying to portray the SDF as an actor you could talk to. These are reasonable people. They're not perfect. There are many things that are wrong in the way they govern. But there's hope. There's hope. They can get better, and they're reasonable people you can negotiate with.
So obviously, I think you're right to point out the difference between think tanks and governments. But on the other hand, again, cycling back to the question about the British, we saw the podcast with Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell. And then before that, there was this talk of people close to Tony Blair being very involved in this kind of rehabilitation, and that this was an ongoing process, like several months in the lead up to the taking of Damascus. So it wasn't kind of an accidental thing, or it was a certain investment, certainly, even if the maybe outcome wasn't inevitable, but that was certainly a calculation on the part of the British establishment.
I'll be very honest. I lack information to make any, insightful comment about it. I'm not dismissing at all, what you're saying. I just lack, reliable information.
So shifting gears, another question I wanted to ask about was about Iran. So Iran had justified its intervention in Syria in support of Assad in terms of maintaining its supply lines to Hezbollah. However, recent evidence has shown that apparently the supply lines remain intact now, a couple of years after or at least a year after the change in the government. Is this just more like pie on the face of Iran? Did they not know this, or was there another reason for them to be intervening at that point?
I would strongly challenge the idea that the chain of supply remains intact. There still are weapons that are shipped across the border between Syria and Lebanon for Hezbollah, but they're using smuggling networks. But I really doubt it compares, both in terms of quantity and quality with what used to be shipped across the border when, the Assad was in charge, and when the IRGC had its, this extensive military infrastructure across Syria, including military factories south of Aleppo, very large stockpiles in the mountains, which were comprehensively destroyed by the Israelis. We're talking about, ballistic missiles and that sort of things. As far as I know, and judging from the announcements by the new Syrian security forces, what they seized are basically, fairly light weapons, like, at least portable weapons, anti-tank missiles, these sort of things. But none of the fairly heavy, military hardware that used to be shipped across the border before. So no, I think Iran and Hezbollah have lost a great deal with the change of regime when it comes to military supplies. And I think Hezbollah's ambitions have adjusted accordingly. I mean, it's really not about survival as a military organization. It's not about, as used to be in the past, being some kind of near peer competitor with Israel. They never were peer competitor, but at least that was the way they were portraying themselves. And I think we've shifted to a completely different situation. So in a nutshell, I think that's always been my view, that the value of Assad for Iran was that he was key to supplying Hezbollah with advanced weaponry. That's always been the most important issue with him.
So in the early days of the takeover of Damascus and other cities in Syria, there was a lot of images coming out of kind of the prominent role of Turkic militias, so Uzbeks, Uyghurs, and so on. And in those early days, there was, depending on your position, either optimistic or critical stances as to, foreign involvement or, what do these people have to do with Syria? Or on the other hand, look, this is, a positive example. This is something different. It's, this kind of jihadi pan-Islamism kind of non-racist or non-regional kind of discrimination. However, these groups seem to have kind of just disappeared, certainly from the limelight. Like we haven't seen anything about them since then. Initially there was talk about either that, yes, these people, they contributed so much to the Syrian revolution, they should get citizenship, or they're going to be integrated into the army. But we haven't heard anything or seen anything about these groups, which raises the question, to what extent can one attribute this and the involvement of these groups to the Turkish role, both, intelligence and military? And in the broader question, what do we know of the Turkish role in the new Syria?
Okay, so there are many issues here. I mean, first, these groups have been, we've heard about them as of late, like especially the Uyghur. One of the 6 highest ranking officers in the new Syrian military is the military leader of the Turkestan Islamic Party in Syria, Dawood Khodabardi. He's the lieutenant general, something like that. He was appointed very early on, after the fall of Assad. He's the head of the division number 84, I think, which is an elite division, which I suppose is tasked with protecting the regime in case things, turn sour for them. So part of them have been integrated. They were already largely under the control of HTS. The Uyghur in particular, they had their own organization, but military speaking, they were completely under the control of HTS for many years. They're completely loyal. I think they're very much trusted partners of the new regime. Other groups, I think some Uzbeks are a bit more problematic, and they've not been fully integrated as far as I understand, and some of them are still based on the coast or in the mountains near the coast, and they're quite few in number, so I don't think they're a major issue either. They're sort of encamped, if I understand well, and that's it. Now, with regard to Turkey, it's hard to tell. It's long been suspected that it's true even before HTS or had a working relationship with Turkey, because it took some time. But even before that, it was rumored that the Turkish intelligence had perhaps closer ties to groups like the TIP, so the Turkestan Islamic Party, or not necessarily Turkic group, because also there were also rumors that they were in good terms with Chechen commanders among various groups, be it Ahrar al-Sham, I think Jund al-Sham, because some of these Chechen commanders had been based in Istanbul for many years. They were refugees in Istanbul after the Chechen wars. So these people were known to Turkish intelligence. And I know it might sound silly, but language was a critical issue for the Turkish intelligence, especially in the first years of the war. The Turkish intelligence and even the Turkish state at large, so the Turkish army and so on, had very limited a very limited number of people who could actually talk Arabic. It's that simple. But the very first officer who defected to Turkey in 2011, Hussein Harmoush, he was abducted by a member of the Turkish intelligence and sent back to Turkey. Because that guy, he was an Arabic-speaking Turkish citizen from the region of Skanderun. I think it was an Alawite. And he was sympathetic to the Syrian regime. And he actually defected himself from Turkey and he sought refuge in Damascus later on. That was the situation of the Turkish intelligence with regard to what was happening in Syria by 2011. So they had few people who could talk Arabic, and those who could were not necessarily reliable for communal reasons. So people who could speak Turkish, either because they were from Turkic-speaking countries, or because they were or regions, or because they had been based in Turkey for a long time, these were extremely valuable. So that, of course, explains also the role of Turkmen-led factions at first in northern Syria. So very early on, they became key interlocutors for the Turkish army and intelligence, both for issues of language. Of course, these are people who could mediate between Turkey and even translate that simply because Turkey and the Syrian rebels. Also because the issue of Turkmens is a very important issue in Turkish politics. Especially since the 90s, there has been much talk and much interest in Turkey in the fate of Turkmens, especially in Iraq, more than in Syria, but in Syria as well. And that, by the way, that was a way for the Turkish government, the AKP government, to legitimize its policies in Syria, which was to emphasize the Turkmen dimension, because the opposition, so mostly the CHP, so the Kemalist opposition, or the MHP, so the far-right opposition, which is no longer the opposition, but used to be, they used to criticize Erdogan's policies in Syria by accusing him of supporting hardline Islamists and so on. The response of the AKP government was to say, but guys, we also support Turkmens. And that's something the opposition could not challenge. Okay, it was by definition it was okay to support Turkmens in Syria. I witnessed that kind of debates firsthand in Turkey at the time, like in 2014. I remember. That's why if you look at in 2014, 2015, when the United States gets involved against the Islamic State in Syria through this so-called train and equip scheme, which was the overt dimension of their support for armed groups in Syria, be they Syrian Democratic Forces or a couple of other former rebel groups, which they were training and equipping to fight the Islamic State and exclusively to fight the Islamic State. And they were doing so very openly. So this program was run by the Pentagon, as opposed to the covert program of support for the Syrian rebels, which was run by the CIA, the so-called Timber Sycamore operation. But anyway, so when the US gets involved, the Turks told them, you should not work with the Syrian Democratic Forces, or at the time it was still called simply the YPG, so the People's Protection Units, because they're PKK, they're terrorists. You should work with the rebels. And more specifically, you should work with our guys. And the guys they were promoting to be key partners of the US in those operations were specifically Turkmen leaders, which later on became the most influential faction commanders within the Syrian National Army, which was the Turkish-backed rebel coalition in northern Syria, which operated as a support force for the Turkish army during its three major operations across northern Syria. So groups like Sultan Suleiman Shah, Sultan Mehmet Fatih, they're often named after Ottoman sultans, or there are references to Turkic civilization like Samarkand, for instance, these sort of things. Yeah, they became extremely influential. For instance, they were key partners of the Sadat, which is the Turkish private military company, which recruited Syrian mercenaries to fight in Libya and in Karabakh, so during the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia in 2020. So they recruited Syrians to support Turkish military operations there. Even in Niger, Sub-Saharan Africa, where this company has been operating as well. So these Turkmen-led factions were the key recruiters of mercenaries in Syria on behalf of Sadat. And now, of course, you find them within the new Syrian Arab army, so the army of the new Syrian government. Some of these people being in key positions, i.e. division commanders, because they still enjoy Turkish support. They still even, some say, enjoy like direct Turkish patronage. They have their own resources as well, because these are fairly smart people who invested parts of their resources in the Turkish economy, and they still derive their own resources from there. So they're not paid solely by the Syrian government, which anyway can't give them much. So they have their own resources. So that means, of course, Turkey remains very prominent within the Syrian military. And it's also a major partner, like in a more, let's say, more traditional bilateral context. Actually, Turkey is pretty much the only military partner of the new Syrian government. They provide training, they provide even some hardware, like light armored vehicles. So yeah, there isn't. At least in the region, no other country is willing to work with the Syrian army to that extent. For instance, Saudi Arabia is mostly an economic partner and the diplomatic one, but not really. It's not really involved in cooperation in matters of defense, or at least at a very limited extent compared to the Turks.
Well, we only have time for one more question, but I do have two questions, so I'm going to try to combine them and we'll see how we do. My first question is about the response of the left to not only what's been happening in Syria, but the Syrian revolution more broadly over the past decade. Obviously, for the left, Syria has been a massive point of contention, and there have been a number of different views. But one among the many views, perhaps the loudest view, has been that any attempt to remove Assad and any attempt to support the removal of Assad would result in a government that is friendly to the interests of the U.S. empire, and that's something that's seen as both undesirable and in the long term negative. There were also debates about intervention, ranging from those who completely opposed intervention, those who opposed intervention but supported the right of the Syrian people to call for it, and then those who, in few cases, actually supported intervention. I'm curious to know what you think the left got right and what the left got wrong on the debate regarding Syria. So that's the first question. And then the second question, somewhat unrelated, but just to round things off, what would you say are the most important issues for us to watch over the coming years in Syria?
Your first question, of course, it brings me back to heated debates we had like 10 years ago. And I don't want to generalize, about the left, because as you said, the left was very much divided, let's say, between what I would call the campist attitude. And of course, saying that immediately, betrays my own take on the matter. But people who would basically oppose the opposition no matter what, because it would serve the US empire. And on the other hand, you had people who would say, well, that's very, very likely that in the end, the US empire will be in a better position when it comes to Syria. But, this regime is such a death machine that it just can't go on. It basically should be toppled at any price, in a way. That's a really tough question, because, as you know, I'm not at all neutral in that debate. I had my own take. I was among, let's say, the liberal hoax, if you want, at the time. Because I knew this uprising was spontaneous, it was legitimate, that because people had been suffering, unspeakable violence under that regime for decades. It didn't start in 2011. The very first person I interviewed when I was doing fieldwork in Syria was the very first guy in 2005. And after an hour or two, told me, well, my father disappeared in 1981 and I haven't heard of him since. So it was we were 24 years later. He didn't know what his father had become. I mean, he knew he was dead, but that's pretty much all he knew about it. And that was, of course, not an isolated case. I mean, thousands and tens of thousands of people in Syria could tell you the same. So, when people finally rose up against that regime, I was just eager to see it, gone as soon as possible. Some people on the left would say, well, but this new regime will also be very friendly to Israel. I don't think this will be the case for reasons we already discussed. And of course, we hear the same now with regard to Iran, right? I think it's more realistic to imagine that if the current Iranian regime was to be toppled, that it would become more friendly to Israel than the new Syrian regime. For a very simple reason, is that Syria is still occupied by Israel. I mean, it has part of its territory is occupied by Israel, and Syrians know it, that they haven't forgotten about it. And it's actually, and the occupation is actually expanding. Likewise, structural constraints that make it very difficult for the new Syrian regime to become friendly with Israel, which is also why in the long run, I do not exclude the possibility that bilateral relations between Syria and the United States will remain. I mean, I do not exclude that they could not deteriorate in the long term. Because let's be honest, I mean, the US will always have better relations with Israel than it will possibly have with Syria. And in the long run, the fact that I think Syria will remain in a difficult relationship with Israel, to put it mildly, the fact that Syria will also very likely remain under strong Turkish influence, and I think that the regional rivalry between Turkey and Israel is here to stay. I think that will be one of the defining features of regional dynamics in the long run, really in the coming decades. I think it's only the beginning for basic geopolitical reasons. There is no buffer state between them. So basically, the Israeli and Turkish spheres of influence are now in direct contact with each other. They run through southern Syria, whereas before there was a buffer state. So I think this regional rivalry will only continue and probably perhaps get bitter. So perhaps that's a thing that the left got wrong. But if the current regime in Iran survives and remains, opposed to Israel, I would not exclude either that in the long run, relations might also improve between Syria and Iran. I mean, they could reconnect with Russia very rapidly, and I know it's more difficult with Iran also for religious reasons, but maybe it can change in the future. As for your second question, what we should watch, of course, what we discussed earlier regarding party politics, regarding the parliament. I'm not saying that parliament should be taken very seriously because it has very limited power, but at least it's an indicator to see if that new regime is ready to allow people to have some formal discussions about politics, some controversial discussions about within state institutions or not. Okay, are they ready to tolerate some level of debate within state institutions or not? So I think it's something to watch. Will they allow the parliament to operate and to have some meaningful debates about I don't know, legal reforms and so on? Then, of course, economics, which will, of course, shape the trajectory of the country. I mean, I have very limited expertise in economics, so I don't like to make very daring forecasts in that respect. And again, as I alluded to earlier, I think in the near future, things will probably improve a bit because they're so bad at the moment that it's difficult for them not to improve somewhat. When you've hit the bottom, then you can only, go back to the surface. But then in the longer run, I'm quite skeptical about this view, this neoliberal approach to reconstruction, that you can just rebuild the country through private investments, which also tend to focus on not very productive sectors like tourism, real estate, and so forth. Yeah, these are the main issues I would be watching in the near future.
I wish I hadn't asked you the question about the left at the very end of our conversation, because now I have a number of questions I want to ask as a follow-up, but unfortunately we're out of time. Maybe we can do another episode if you're willing, maybe just a short episode on the left, Syria on the left. I think that would be a great conversation to have with you. But for now, we're going to have to call it a day. Thank you very much, Thomas. It was a great conversation.
Thanks a lot to you.
And to our listeners, we do hope you enjoyed this episode, and we welcome your comments, feedback, and suggestions. Send us an email at proteanview@muftah.org. If you're hearing this on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, we'd really appreciate a 5-star review or a like. This helps improve the visibility of our show. With your support, we can keep Protean View running and gradually improve it. Visit us at muftah.org and navigate to the Protean View tab to see all our episodes, and follow us on our socials using the handle @ProteanView, including on Patreon, where you can become a paid patron and receive exclusive content. Until next time.